You're listening to an archived Cabral Concept podcast. After listening to this show, check out the most up-to-date podcasts available at stephencabral.com/podcasts or search directly on iTunes. And now, welcome to the Cabral Concept, where board-certified naturopath and integrative health practitioner Dr. Stephen Cabral shares how he was diagnosed at the age of 17 with a life-altering illness and given no hope for recovery. It was only after studying and traveling all over the world did he discover how to combine ancient Ayurvedic healing practices with state-of-the-art naturopathic and functional medicine to fully rebalance the body and re-energize it with life. It's time to discover how to get well, lose weight, and finally feel alive again. And now, here's your host, Dr. Stephen Cabral.
Welcome back to the Cabral Concept. Great to have you with me here today. Looking forward to another show. Today we are on our Total Wellness Tuesday topics. So a lot of people have been writing in, and I've seen your questions come in. I do appreciate them. And I want to do a whole show following up a little bit more on mold toxicity, specifically today, how to eat a low mold food diet so that you don't have as many of the symptoms that we spoke about on episode 992. I'm going to do a little bit of an overview, so if you haven't tuned into that show, I'll catch you back up, and hopefully you will go back. Check out episode 992 on the mold toxicity quiz, so you can absolutely take that quiz over there. And then also on episode, I believe it was 1048, I'll link that up as well. That's our entire mold toxicity protocol. Just do keep in mind on the Cabral Concept, everything that we do in my private practice is absolutely given to you for free. We tell you exactly how we do it. We've helped now well over 250,000 client appointments and literally work with people all over the world. Our goal is to basically open source exactly what we do. You can see all of our protocols at equilibriumnutrition.com. You can see all the labs we run over there. You can run them with your local practitioner. You can run them yourself by purchasing right at that website. You can do it however you want. But our goal is to empower people to understand that there's absolutely a reason why you feel the way that you do. And there's absolutely a reason why you can't lose the weight and why you feel like you're aging at a much faster rate. What we do is just try to simply demystify that. It doesn't have to be a mystery. You know, I was diagnosed with a mystery-based illness, right? They didn't know what it was for 2 years. And the only reason they ever officially diagnosed me was because I went to a so-called alternative medicine practitioner, and they ran some functional medicine lab tests in the same labs we do today. Then I took them back to my PCP, and they said, oh, okay, well, you know, I don't know about this test because they're not used to it, but we'll run some blood work. And they did that. And then, of course, they started to get all these different diagnoses. But the problem is this, that no matter what you're diagnosed with, again, we know that that's simply a name given to a collection of symptoms. But what are the underlying root causes? So for me, you know, it's about education. That's honestly what it's all about, is that once I started to learn that there was an actual way to break all of this down, that you could literally run a lab, you could find out what your imbalances are, whether you were toxic, such as mold, we'll talk about that today, or you had deficiencies, such as B6 or magnesium or any of these things, right? Then we could replace those. And I know it seems almost too easy. It's not too easy. I don't want to denigrate it, put it down, or anything like that, because it's not too easy. I mean, you still have to rebalance the body, all of those things, but that is why the body becomes imbalanced. And I don't really want to make it more complicated than that, because that's the truth. It doesn't mean it's a quick fix. It doesn't mean it's an overnight fix. A lot of people will tell you that, you know, they'll sell you an ebook about it or whatever it is, but that's not the truth. There's no overnight fix. We can get a lot done within 21 days, but what we need to do is repair those cells over a 12 to 16 week period of time. And that's when people say the so-called miraculous-based healing. Well, it's not really miraculous-based healing. What we're doing are taking out a lot of the toxicities, such as the mold and yeast-based symptoms we're going to talk about today, that's accounting for a lot of how people feel. And then we replace a lot of the deficiencies. And the truth is that a lot of those deficiencies came in the first place because of these toxicities. And I'm going to break that down for exactly what that means today. Some of your children might be suffering from this, maybe relatives, brothers, sisters, siblings, parents, you know? So you might be perfectly fine, or this might not be an issue for you. The goal is you learn the information, you know enough about it to pass it along to someone else. Have them listen to the podcast, see if it's the right fit for them. Have them speak with their practitioner about it. You know, just start to make this more well-known. So what I'd love you to do is, even while listening to this podcast, head on over to, while you're listening to it, stephencabral.com/992. And you can just read over the mold toxicity symptoms quiz. I would love you to listen to the podcast as well. It goes a little bit more in depth, understanding how this whole mold thing is happening, right? But as we go through it, just think about it like, do you suffer from fatigue or dull headaches or sensitivity to light? Do you have a lot of congestion in the sinuses or chest or lungs? Do you get a lot of differences in mood swings? Do you have sometimes a metallic taste in your mouth? Do you feel worse on damp or rainy-based days or the day after that? So, it's some of those symptoms. There's 25 that I wrote about on that page. And that's just from me going through it myself and living this and also doing a lot of research. That's really what it's all about is, you're not going to go and become a naturopathic doctor either, and they're going to teach you everything you know about mold toxicity. They're not. You're going to learn about mold, but not in depth. And the reason is that you learn from clinical practice. And I learn from reading a lot of research. And I learn from many of the mentors that I had as well. And then you collect more of your own data, and then you continue to see thousands of people, and then you see what works and what doesn't work. I mean, this is the real world. That's how the real world works. Not textbook real world, but real world, right? This is what works in the real world. I'd love to say to you that a lot of stuff that I read in the research, I'm like, oh, yeah, that's absolutely fantastic. I'm going to use it in my practice. No, never. Never do that. Never do that. No one in my practice will ever be a guinea pig for some new thing like 1 off or 2 off or even 10 off research. I want to know, does that match up with 6,000 years of Ayurvedic study? What about traditional Chinese medicine? What do they say about it in traditional naturopathy? And if you're like, oh, yeah, it matches up with that, it makes sense, I'll start to use it myself. If I start to feel a pretty good result or there's no negatives, and I look through the research of all the different herbs or whatever it might be, then I say, okay, this isn't going to replace anything in my practice because I know what I'm doing is working. But maybe it's an add-on or maybe it's an adjunct. That's how I will look at it. Okay, so I want to get right into today's show because we have a lot to talk about. So if you're unfamiliar with mold, just understand that, and I went over this on episode 1048, so I believe it's worth listening to that show as well. Because in the UK and the US is where they did these studies, right? But this could account for anywhere in the world, is that over 54% of people's homes have some type of mold in them, okay? A lot of times it's in the basement. Sometimes it's in the air conditioning ducts. Sometimes it's in the bathrooms. Sometimes it's up in the ceiling and walls. And why is that? Well, if the roof's ever leaked, if the walls have ever leaked, if you've ever had a flood into the basement or water in your basement, that's where mold starts to grow. It's a natural thing. It's been around in the world a lot longer than we have, right? Mold's been around forever. So when we look at that, we say, okay, well, how does it affect us? Because you're not eating it, right? Well, we'll get to that in a moment. So here's the issue with mold, is that the invisible spores, because it can grow, think of it like a fungus, all right? So think of it this way. Yeast, fungus, mold, they're all cousins. I mean, literally, they're all part of the same family, okay? So you want to look at it that way. And when we look at it that way, we can say, okay, we know what happens when we have candida overgrowth. Would that be kind of similar to mold? Yes, it would. Yeah, it would have a lot of similarities, right? So we'll talk about candida, we'll talk about yeast, and a lot of these then help for those as well. So the other issue is this. So we know we can get it in our home just from dampness, okay? We can get it from the environment. If you live in an area that's fairly damp, meaning you get a lot of rain, you could be exposed to mold. If you live in an area like I do in New England, where the leaves fall every fall, okay? So that means that we're getting moldy leaves. And then what about in the spring, which is why I'm going over this now because I'm giving you a 3 to 4 week head start before spring, is when the snow melts and we have the leaves exposed or grass exposed underneath, we have mold, all right? You can't always see it, but it can be tested for, without a doubt. I mean, you could test this in your home. I've linked that up on previous shows. And what happens is this. The mold spores are invisible. We breathe them in through our nasal passages. They can get trapped in our sinuses or go right into our bloodstream. Okay, they can go into our lungs. We can also, and I did not mention this yet, but we can be exposed to it through food. So that's going to be the topic for today's show. Really, really important. And the reason for that is that we never know that these things are entering our body. And the reason we don't know that they're entering our body, for the most part, they are invisible. You can't really taste them, okay? You can see it on something, like cheese, okay? So when you look at aged cheese, you can see that greenish blue color. Some of that is mold, okay? Some of that is the penicillin that you're growing on that cheese, and that's mold, right? A lot of people purposely eat that, which is interesting to me. But anyway, they enjoy it. They like it. They do or don't have a problem with it. We don't know, right? They very well may, but they've just part of their normal. So I look at it this way. When you have mold in your body, the interesting thing is this. It begins to cause havoc. And the reason it causes havoc is that mold has been shown to actually shut down parts of your immune system. So there's different types. There's the mold itself, like the aspergillus and the penicillium. I'm not going to get too deep on this for today because you don't need to know all the names. And sometimes we get lost with all of the science of the names. We need to do real-world application on the Cabral concept. That's what it's all about. I'll do the research. I'll read the science and read all the different names. What I want to do is bring you the actual what to do, okay? So we have a couple of these toxins. Ochratoxin A, OTA, is a big one. And we're going to talk about another one today just called gliotoxin, GTX. So why these are important is that they come from both the aspergillus and the penicillium family. So you're going to get them on contaminated foods. I'll talk about those in just one moment. But what happens is this. They actually begin to impair our T cells. Okay, our T cells are what help us keep cancer cells at bay in the body. But they also tell certain white blood cells in our body, such as monocytes, to create what's called apoptosis. Sorry, tongue twister right there for a second. And what that means is this. It actually is cell-programmed death. So it is able to tell those cells to actually destroy themselves. Now, that's a natural process in our body because when a cell is malfunctioning, it sacrifices itself for the good of the body. So it shuts down and it destroys itself. It essentially implodes and then it gets cleaned up by the rest of the body. Well, mold toxicity in our body, believe it or not, causes that. Here's why it causes that. It's a protective mechanism because if those white blood cells in our immune system was functioning at its highest level, it would kill the mold on its own. So what mold does is it tries to shut down those processes within the body. Here's what a lot of other people don't know, though, and this is why we have a very specific system to get rid of mold. Mold and the mycotoxins. So mycotoxins just means myco, think of it as mold, toxins, right? So it's the toxins, the waste that's given off by mold. And there's many different responses to it. But here's something very interesting. It begins to destroy our gut bacteria, specifically the lactic acid base producing bacteria, like the lactobacilli. And those are a lot of those in the small intestine. Well, this is interesting, right? Because how many people out there have IBS or SIBO or candida overgrowth? You have those things much of the time because you don't have a lot of the lactobacilli producing bacteria. And the reason we need those is because it actually keeps the environment more acid. And the reason why that's important is so that there can't be a lot of bacterial overgrowth. Your small intestine should be much more sterile. It's not sterile, right? But it should have much less bacteria growing there than the colon. And that's important. So we have a lot of absorption going on in the small intestine, specifically the first quarter of it. And then we have to make sure that we don't have a lot of overgrowth of bacteria, colon-based bacteria that can sneak up through the ileocecal valve, or bacteria that we get because we have low stomach acid, or we're eating improper foods. Many different reasons, right? Taking antibiotics, drinking a lot of alcohol, taking birth control, using a lot of Advil, ibuprofen, drinking tap water that contains chlorine and fluoride. All of these, right? Splenda, sucralose, all these things begin to hurt our gut microbiome. How about all the pesticides and the glyphosate, right? All of those begin to hurt our microbiome. So that allows then, because we're making the space more hospitable now for yeast, fungus, we'll call those candida, as well as mold, its cousin. So that's very important for me to look at because then it can also create leaky gut or intestinal permeability from all the inflammation that's happening there. And that's because now the immune cells, it sees the additional fungal overgrowth, it sees the mold, and it will go after that, and that will create inflammation. Okay, really, really important. So after we have the leaky gut, well, then what? Well, we're going to have all sorts of issues potentially with CD4 cells, CD8 cells, interleukin 8, and none of those things may mean anything to you, and that's okay. But a lot of those things, as well as the increase in what's called inflammatory prostaglandins, creates a lot of these autoimmune-based issues that we see. Okay, so we're now looking at the gut, and it's toxins that could create a lot more issues. Just a few more that I want to give you before I just give you that low mold diet. So besides the inflammation we spoke about, the cell death, we have the blunting of the villi. Now, the villi are essentially the enterocytes that are the little finger-like structures, like a shag carpet. We talk about this actually in the Integrative Health Practitioner certification in course. And why those are important. And they come under attack under inflammation and a lot of other issues. But those are what produce a lot of those happy, feel-good neurotransmitters, like serotonin, helps to produce our energy-based vitamins, like our B vitamins, such as B12, helps with absorption of all of our amino acids and also carbohydrates. So this is why when people say, well, I feel so fantastic on a keto-based diet, I feel so fantastic on a carnivore-based diet, I feel so fantastic when I cut out all carbs. Well, one of the reasons is if you have candida overgrowth, if you have mycotoxins, if you have any of these things from mold, it begins to break down your body's ability to actually transport fructose through the GI tract. So it causes what? Fermenting. Fructose will ferment. And it's called GLUT5, GLUT5. You can look it up if you'd like. And these are transporter molecules. There's another one, SGLTI. And again, you don't need to know what any of these mean. But the research has already been done. These things are proven. So does that person really have an aversion? They call them plant toxins, which is kind of hilarious. But, do they really have an aversion to carbohydrates, or do they have a much deeper problem that they're not paying attention to that's actually going to cause a host of issues in the future? Yes, that's the latter. The latter is true. If you can't eat carbohydrates, now I'm not saying you need to eat them, okay? You can go on a lower carb diet. But if you can't eat them, that's a problem. Don't go on a keto diet or a carnivore-based diet because you can't eat carbs. Go on a keto or carnivore-based diet because you want to. You want to experiment with that. Fine, go for it. But don't do it because you have a problem. If you have a problem with carbohydrates, there's a much deeper problem. Don't put a Band-Aid over it. I'm pleading with you not to do that. You don't need to work with us. You don't need to run an organic acids test or a stool test. You don't need to do those things with us if you don't want to. I'm okay with that. But figure out the problem, because for sure there's a problem and you are not getting rid of it by just taking away its food source. That's it. Sure, you'll shrink it, but it doesn't mean you're going to get rid of it. That's for sure. Because I'm telling you, one day you'll eat carbs again and it will just flourish and it will grow right back. Okay, let's move on now to the mycotoxin-based diet, the mold-based diet. All right. So reason I wanted to bring this to you is that at least in the northern part of the United States and in a lot of the damper climates, and that goes for anywhere where you get a decent amount of rain, you could have a lot more mold in that environment. All right, springtime for us, fall time for us here in the U.S. and Europe. It counts in Europe as well, and then anywhere in the world. So let's look at this. Why does this matter? Well, a lot of the foods I'm about to speak about with you right now are great for people that have histamine issues, they get migraines, they have yeast overgrowth, they have mold-based issues. They all go together. They really do. And the reason they do is because there's massive gut dysfunction and there's an immune imbalance. Most people with mold overgrowth, with fatigue and the congestion, all of those things, have what's called a lot of Th2 dominance in their immune system. And again, you don't need to know that either. But it means that your body sways towards chronic inflammation. Okay, so let's go over these without further ado. All types of cheese are going to be higher in potential mold and also mold exacerbating symptoms. So these things don't always have to have mold, but they can exacerbate mold symptoms. Now, if you had to pick one, the fresher raw goat cheese or sheep's cheese would be a much better choice. They're softer, they're fresh, they are not aged, okay? What else? Vinegars, okay? Any food preserved in vinegar. Now, a lot of people don't like this, but when I say fermented food, yes, that's one as well. Okay, I'm going to teach you how to add these foods back into your diet in just a moment. So salad dressings, white vinegar. I even don't do Bragg's apple cider vinegar. I don't do Bragg's apple cider vinegar until I help the person heal. And then we add the Bragg's apple cider vinegar back in if they choose to, okay? The fermented yogurts, right? So we'll consider this its own category. Fermented yogurts, kefir, buttermilk, and it also includes the non-dairy ones, the coconut milk and those types of ones. Why? Is simply because of the bacteria right now. We haven't repopulated the gut in the proper way, so we're not going to add more bacteria quite yet. Okay, canned foods in general, we don't know. Now, they're going to be acid, so they're going to be lower enough of a pH, which should not allow for that mold to grow. However, any aged food, and that includes canned juice, is suspect to it allowing for mold and mold growth to come. And a lot of these foods, such as like grape juice, which a lot of kids are getting, come from a moldy food in the first place. Okay, let's go over a few more. Dried fruit. I'll put them all together. Dried fruit and all of your dried grains that come in bags. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about this. It's more specifically the fruit right now, okay? So figs and cranberries and prunes and apricots and raisins are a big one. Raisins are a real big one, right? Because they come from the grapes, which can have mold on them. So vine-growing berries, I shouldn't say berries as much because blueberries are okay, but vine-growing varieties such as grapes are a big one, especially when they're dried. Now, how do you get around that for fruit? Well, you're just going to, even if it's organic, you're just going to wash your fruit really well. Okay, that's important. Now, I actually allow people to have some grains after 3 weeks. What do I allow? Well, I allow some gluten-free rice, so non-contaminated, and gluten-free oats. Now, here's the difference, though. We need to make sure that these oats, ideally it's from a company that tests to make sure that they're mold-free, but it's all about the storage because the oats are not going to have as much of the mold, and neither is the rice when they grow, but it's the way that they're stored that they can grow mold. That's important to look at. Same with oats aren't really going to have gluten in them. Like we're talking tiny, tiny parts per million. But what we're talking about, or gliadin, I should say, what we're talking about, though, is the contamination when they're put on a conveyor belt or in a different place, or that's with the gluten. And the mold is, are they stored in a damp environment? And if they are, well, they can allow for some mold. So what we do is we take it out of the diet for 3 weeks. We get people on a protocol, and then we add, let's just say oatmeal, or add rice back in as the only new variable 3 times, 2 to 3 times. So we watch for a reaction. Does the person get a little bit of stuffy nose? Do they get a headache? Do they feel like a little bit more tired and joint pain? And if they do, we say, okay, we can't do it. We just can't do it for right now. We'll try again in another 6 weeks. Maybe we'll also try a different brand. I like more of the oat grouts or the steel cut oats. And the reason I do, and 1 Degree is a great brand. I started using them lately. Again, I'm not sponsored by them, but great brand. They're sprouted. Or let's just say, yeah, and they're still cut. And they have a more of an outer layer. And the outer layer is going to help to make them hopefully more mold resistant rather than when they're open and cut out flat, meaning like when the oats are flat, they're able to soak up more moisture. That's how I look at it. That's how I see it. I'm looking more into that research, but absolutely I've seen it in my practice work a lot better. Okay, we talked about fermented foods. Let's talk about breads. Wheat is considered a damp food. In Ayurvedic medicine and traditional Chinese medicine, it's considered damp, right? So wheat is one of those. A lot of fish is as well, believe it or not, considered a damp food. All alcohol, beer, wine, especially beer and wine. So a little less with your hard alcohols, but beer and wine are horrible for mold, and especially red wine for yeast and histamine-based issues. Okay. Let's go over some other things. Anything that's higher in sugar. I'm talking processed sugar, okay? Anything higher in sugar is going to feed that mold, fungus, and yeast. Really, really important to look at. I already gave you my non-canned food speech because of the potential for mold spores getting into those cans before anything's ever canned, right? And just how they're stored. Coffee. Coffee is a big one because, again, how is coffee stored? Well, it's stored as a bean in giant vats. And the other thing is, once it's turned to a powder, even greater potential for mold as well. It doesn't have any of its natural plant-based chemicals to keep the mold away. And then again, I'm not going to cut a lot of fruit out of people's diet. I will. We have a very special list. It's about 2 dozen fruit and about 3 dozen vegetables that people can eat that won't feed candida, yeast, mold, fungus, but they're just going to make sure that they wash them really well. Okay, so what does it leave you with? Well, it leaves you with essentially what we talk about, which is the first part of our elimination diet. Our elimination diet doesn't just say, eliminate your FODMAP foods, your fructo oligo di mono and polysaccharides. It's actually eliminating a lot of higher lectin foods, a lot of histamine foods. We go through all of those things and they work really well. But you can still have your great olive oils, and you can do a little coconut oil if you want. We don't do raw nuts and seeds. A lot of people allow this. Just too much contamination as well with nuts and seeds. So we'll add those in as their own variable. Lots of fruit, lots of vegetables we have in there. We have a lot of vegan-based proteins. We have meat and fish, depending on what the person chooses to eat. So there's still plenty of foods to eat. It's just going to be a much cleaner diet. What does that cleaner diet do? Well, it allows you to achieve all of your goals, right? So it reduces inflammation. It will help you lose weight if you need to lose weight. You start to have more energy, all of the great things that accompany that. So that's a great part of it. So let me just go over that once again. So I want to make this super easy. Any food that's been aged. So think about it. Has it been aged? Pickles, fermented food, wines, anything like that, okay? You're going to, sauerkraut, all of those things you're going to cut out. Has it been canned? If you are, you're going to try to cut those out to the best of your ability, okay? Has it been fermented? That's another one. So is it the fermented vegetables? Is it the vinegars? Is it mustards? Anything like that, okay? So if it's been fermented or preserved, you're going to cut those out. So I always say, has it been fermented? Has it been aged? Leftovers aren't good for mold as well, especially after 6 hours. So try to eat things the same day if possible. Slow cooker will help. You can keep it in a slow cooker if you want. Just keep on cooking it. Just don't allow it to cool and then expose it to the air, which again can grow those mold spores. And then spices. Spices can drive a lot of people with histamines crazy, but it will not affect the mold specifically, right? Unless the spice has mold spores in it. So our ultimate goal is to not to worry tremendously about the foods, right? We want that. We have to worry about in the beginning. But our goal is to ultimately get rid of the mold. So there is something called a mycotox test. I will link that up in the show notes today. Simply head on over to StephenCabral.com/1103. So 1103, 1103. StephenCabral.com, 1103. I will link up episode 922. I'll link up episode, that's the mold toxicity quiz and symptoms, important to listen to first. And then 1048, which tells you our whole mold toxicity protocol. And that will hopefully allow you to understand the process. So you can test for mold or you can begin the process. And the process is not that difficult. I go in depth on how to do it, but essentially you're doing a detox first to open up those liver pathways. You have to open up the pathways first to be able to remove well. You can do the saunas with it. All of those are great. And there's actually, if you look at the research on saunas and mold, it's fantastic. I'll get to that on another show because I know I've taken up my time for today. And then we're going to do, typically with most people, the candida and bacterial overgrowth protocol. And then after that, after we've started to get rid of the yeast and bacteria in the gut, then we'll put in those lactobacilli, we'll close up the gut wall. That will already help with the mold because we're going to be then rebalancing the immune system, sealing up the gut wall, and then we're going to do our mold protocol. So it's straightforward. It works. It doesn't make you change your whole life. And then we help people get rid of all these symptoms they have, and that's what it's all about. So hopefully today's show is helpful. I know there's so many people out there suffering and not even knowing with all these issues, whether it's candida and bacterial overgrowth, whether it's mold overgrowth, whatever it might be. So just try to share the word if possible. If you feel this was helpful, please do feel free to pass along to anyone else you believe it could serve. Take care, everyone. Before you go, I wanted to share a personal story with you. The real reason I began to get well finally is because I figured out what was wrong with me. And that might seem pretty obvious, but I went from doctor to doctor for over 2 years before discovering at-home functional medicine lab testing. These are the labs that enabled me to finally figure out what was wrong with my hormones, blood sugar, electrolytes, and gut health. And once I knew what was wrong, I could then follow a proven plan in order to rebalance my body from the inside out. This is why I believe so strongly in functional medicine lab testing and why I've made it my mission to share these labs with the world. Now at equa.life, you can order an at-home lab test or a lab bundle for you and your family and be able to complete it within the week. Plus, the EquaLife difference is that you're not left to try to read and figure out these labs on your own. We explain what your lab numbers mean, what they mean in the much bigger picture, and then how to go about rebalancing your body in order to heal. To see our full selection of lab tests, or to set up a free lab selection call to find out what labs may be best for you, simply head on over to equa.life/labs. And do remember, we ship these all over the world. To find out more and to set up your free lab selection call, simply head on over to equa.life/labs. That's EQUI.LIFE/labs.